3 men rode into a desert pass carrying mercy instead of murder, and what they found there defied every law of the frontier they knew. The choice they made in those burning hours would haunt 2 territories, unravel a peace that had held for half a decade, and leave lawmen asking a question no one could answer. Why would outlaws risk everything for a stranger whose last words were spoken in a tongue none of them understood? Some said it was guilt, others claimed it was prophecy, but those who knew the full story understood it was something far more dangerous than either. The Mojave stretched endless and pale under a sun that seemed to have forgotten the concept of mercy. It was April of 1877, and the desert floor shimmered with heat that turned distant mountains into wavering ghosts. The pass, known locally as Rattlesnake Throat, cut through a series of low hills where the sand gave way to broken rock and scattered sage. Few travelers took this route, unless they had reason to avoid the main roads, and fewer still stopped to examine what the desert chose to reveal. But on the morning of April 14th, 3 riders moved through that pass with the careful pace of men who understood that haste in such country meant death. They rode single file, their horses' hooves making soft percussion against sand and stone. The man in front was lean and weathered, his face hidden beneath a hat brim stained dark with years of sweat and dust. Behind him rode a younger man with a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his mouth, a white line against sun-darkened skin. The third man was broader, older, with hands that looked too large for the reins he held with surprising gentleness. They called themselves merchants when anyone bothered to ask. Sometimes they claimed to be surveyors or ranch hands between jobs. The truth was simpler and more complicated. They were men who moved through the spaces where law grew thin, taking what opportunities presented themselves and leaving before questions could take root. They had robbed a payroll wagon outside of Barstow 6 days earlier, and the money sewn into their saddlebags represented enough to start fresh somewhere the past wouldn't follow. They had no intention of stopping, no reason to linger in a past that offered nothing but heat and isolation. But the horse changed everything. The lean man spotted it first, a dark shape against lighter rock about 30 yards off the trail. He raised a hand and the others stopped behind him, their animals grateful for even this brief respite. For a long moment they sat in silence, studying the shape with the practiced wariness of men who knew that the desert revealed only what it wanted you to see. The horse was dead. That much became clear as they approached. It lay on its side, a paint mare with dried foam at its mouth and a bullet wound in its chest. The shot had been clean, merciful, the kind a man makes when his mount is suffering and there's no other choice. The saddle was gone, the bridle cut away. But what held their attention was the direction the tracks led, away from the dead animal toward a cluster of rocks that formed a natural shelter against the southern face of the hill. The lean man dismounted first. His hand rested on the pistol at his hip, not drawing it but making its presence known. The others followed his lead, spreading out slightly, forming a loose triangle as they moved toward the rocks. Their boots made whisper sounds against the sand. They found him in the shadow of the largest boulder, propped against stone as if he'd chosen this spot with great care. He was still alive, though barely, his breathing shallow and irregular. His skin was darker than theirs, burned almost black by sun and heritage both, and his hair hung long and loose around a face carved with lines that spoke of both laughter and hardship. He wore clothing that marked him as neither white nor Mexican, the remnants of a buckskin shirt and leggings decorated with beadwork that had seen better days. Blood had soaked through the shirt on his right side, dark and dry, and his lips were cracked and pale. The young man with the scar took a step backward. The broader man simply stood, his expression unreadable, but the lean man knelt, and after a moment's hesitation, he uncorked his canteen and held it to the dying man's lips. Water spilled down the warrior's chin, but some made it past his lips. His eyes opened, dark and surprisingly clear, focusing on the lean man's face with an intensity that seemed at odds with his condition. He spoke then, words in a language none of them recognized, syllables that rose and fell like song. The broad man glanced at his companions, but the warrior's hand shot out with surprising speed, gripping the lean man's wrist. His fingers were cold despite the heat. "I was sent to wait for the three. They said you would come when the time." The grandmother, the one who sees beyond the turn of days. The warrior's breathing hitched and fresh blood appeared at the corner of his mouth. "She said, 3 shadows from the west." The silence that followed was profound. Around them the desert continued its eternal work, wind shifting sand grain by grain, the sun climbing toward its zenith. But in that small shelter formed by ancient rock, 3 outlaws stared at a dying man who should not have known anything about them, who should not have been waiting in this particular pass at this particular hour. The young man broke the silence first. How could he know about Barstow? The lean man studied the warrior's face, searching for deception or madness or fevered confusion. He found none of those things. What he found was certainty, and beneath that something that looked almost like relief. "What do you want from us?" he asked quietly. The warrior's grip loosened, his hand falling back to his side. "Not want, need, must deliver. Message to the woman in calico, the one who." "What treaty, what path?" The lean man leaned closer, urgency creeping into his tone. "Who shot you?" But the warrior's eyes had begun to lose focus, his gaze drifting past them toward the white sky. His breathing grew more labored, a wet rattle beginning deep in his chest. The lean man looked at his companions, a question in his eyes that none of them wanted to answer. They could leave. They could mount their horses and ride on, putting this strange encounter behind them like so many others. They owed this man nothing. His message, his treaty, his path, none of it concerned them. They were outlaws with stolen money and a need to disappear, not messengers or saviors or any of the things his fevered words seemed to suggest. The broad man voiced what they were all thinking. "We need to go. Every minute we stay here, we're closer to getting caught." The lean man remained kneeling, his hand still near the warrior's shoulder. He studied the dying man's face, the proud structure of his features, the scars that marked him as someone who'd survived more than most. In the beadwork on his shirt, barely visible beneath the dried blood, he could make out patterns that suggested birds in flight, or perhaps arrows pointing toward some distant target. "He knew about Barstow," the lean man said finally. "He knew there would be 3 of us. In a pass no one uses, at exactly the right time." The lean man shook his head. "And what about the woman in calico, the house of many colors?" The warrior's hand moved again, fumbling at his belt. The young man tensed, his hand dropping to his gun, but the warrior was only reaching for a small leather pouch tied there. His fingers were too weak to manage the knot. After a moment's hesitation, the lean man helped him, loosening the cord and taking the pouch. Inside was a piece of white stone, smooth and round as a coin, with a hole drilled through its center. A cord of braided leather ran through the hole. The stone was marked with symbols the lean man didn't recognize, carved deep and filled with what might have been red ochre or dried blood. "Give to her," the warrior whispered. "She will know, she will understand." But the warrior's eyes had closed. His chest still rose and fell, but each breath came longer after the last, as if he were forgetting how to perform the simple task of living. His lips moved soundlessly, forming words in that language they couldn't understand, and the lean man had the unsettling sense that the dying man was speaking not to them, but to someone they couldn't see, someone who waited just beyond the edge of perception. The sun had climbed higher, shrinking the shadow that offered them shelter. The horses stood patient and miserable in the heat, their heads low. Somewhere in the distance a hawk cried out, the sound sharp and lonely against the vast silence of the desert. The lean man, Calhoun, looked up at him. "You know what they'll do if they find us carrying that payroll. And if someone's looking for this man, If people come asking about him, about who might have seen him. Calhoun gestured toward the dead horse, the tracks they'd left approaching this place. The young man crouched down beside them. His name was Reed, and despite the scar that made him look dangerous, he was the youngest of the three, barely 23. What are you saying? That we should take him somewhere, bury him proper? I'm saying, Calhoun said slowly, that a dying man knew things he shouldn't have known, that he was waiting specifically for us, that he has a message he believes is important enough to die holding. Superstition, the broad man Gaines said flatly. Talking about omens and prophecy, Calhoun. We're thieves, not priests. But Calhoun was looking at the stone in his palm, turning it over, feeling the grooves of the carved symbols. Calico's 2 days south, closer than anywhere we were planning to hole up, small mining town, lots of transients, easy to blend in. Calhoun looked at the warrior, whose breathing had become almost imperceptible. Every time I aim a gun, Reed said quietly. Every time I take something that isn't mine, every choice matters, Calhoun. It's a reason to make an informed one. Calhoun tucked the stone into his shirt pocket. We go to Calico, we find this woman, we deliver the message. Gaines stared at him for a long moment, and something in his expression suggested he was weighing more than just the immediate risk. Finally, he put his hat back on and stood. This is a mistake, feels like a mistake in my bones. Noted, Calhoun said. They fashioned a rough travois from dead sage and rope, lashing it behind Gaines' horse. The warrior made no sound as they lifted him onto it, his body limp and burning with fever despite the cold sweat on his skin. His eyes remained closed, his breathing so shallow it was hard to tell if he still lived. They wrapped him in one of their blankets to shield him from the sun, and covered the travois with brush to make it less obvious what they carried. By the time they finished, the sun stood directly overhead, and the desert had become a vast white furnace. They mounted without speaking and turned their horses south, toward Calico, toward answers they weren't sure they wanted, toward a woman who kept a house of many colors and might know what a dying warrior's message really meant. None of them looked back at the dead horse or the spot where they'd found the warrior. None of them spoke about the choice they'd just made, or the choices that had led them to this pass at this hour on this particular day. But as they rode, Calhoun found his hand returning again and again to his shirt pocket, touching the smooth stone there, feeling the carved symbols he couldn't read, but somehow knew mattered more than the money in his saddlebags. The desert stretched before them, indifferent and eternal, keeping its secrets the way it always had. Behind them, in the shadow of the rocks, a dark stain marked the sand where the warrior had waited for 3 men who carried shadow but sought light. The wind would erase it eventually, the way the wind erased everything in this country. But for now it remained, a testament to something that had begun but not yet ended, a story whose final chapter had not yet been written. By dusk they had covered 12 miles, moving as quickly as they dared with the travois bouncing and scraping behind them. They stopped twice to give the warrior water, and twice he swallowed without opening his eyes, his throat working mechanically. But he's not, Calhoun said. But he's not, Reed agreed. They made camp in a dry wash as the last light bled from the sky. They built no fire, not wanting to advertise their presence, and ate cold jerky while the horses cropped at sparse desert grass. The warrior lay motionless on the travois, his breathing unchanged, neither better nor worse. Gaines sat with his back against a rock, cleaning his pistol with methodical care. Reed stood watch on the rim of the wash, a dark silhouette against the purple sky. Calhoun sat near the warrior, watching him in the failing light. The man's face had taken on a waxy quality, as if he were already becoming something other than alive. But his eyes moved beneath closed lids, and occasionally his lips would form silent words. Once clearly he said something that sounded like grandmother, and once he said what might have been a name, though Calhoun couldn't make it out. You think he's really seen something? Gaines asked without looking up from his gun. Or is this just fever talking? Calhoun didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about the way the warrior had gripped his wrist, the certainty in those dark eyes. He was thinking about Barstow, about the three of them, about the improbable series of choices and chances that had led them to that particular pass at that particular moment. He was thinking about the word the warrior had used, sent, and what it might mean to be sent to wait for someone you'd never met in a place you might die alone. I think, Calhoun said finally, that he believes it, which means someone else believes it. Or something in calico that's going to get us killed, Gaines said. He snapped the cylinder back into his pistol with a soft click. Treaty, he said. The treaty is broken. You know what that sounds like to me. If we live that long, Reed called down from the rim. Both men were on their feet instantly, guns drawn, moving to positions that gave them cover and sight lines. Calhoun scrambled up beside Reed, peering into the gathering darkness. At first he saw nothing, just the desert turning from purple to black, the first stars appearing overhead. Then he caught it movement, perhaps half a mile distant, barely visible in the last dregs of twilight. Could be, Calhoun agreed. They watched in silence as the distant riders moved across the landscape and finally disappeared behind a rise. The desert settled into full darkness, the stars multiplying overhead until the sky looked like a field of diamonds scattered on black velvet. Somewhere far off a coyote called, and another answered, and the sound seemed to underscore the immense loneliness of the land. They took turns on watch that night, 2 hours each, while the others slept fitfully and the warrior continued his slow dying. "We're here," Calhoun said. "I am already." "Peace," the warrior said simply. "I'm not a hero," Calhoun said quietly. "None of us are. We're outlaws." "Yes." The warrior's eyes seemed to focus on him then, and Calhoun felt seen in a way that was deeply uncomfortable. "You rob because you were robbed. You run because you were chased. You hide because you were hunted, but shadow is not the same as darkness." Before Calhoun could respond, the warrior's hand moved to his chest, pressing against the wound there. His breathing hitched once, twice, and then stopped. His eyes remained open, staring at something beyond the rim of the wash, beyond the stars, beyond whatever barrier separated this world from the next. Calhoun reached out and closed those eyes, his hand gentle despite the tremor in his fingers. He sat back on his heels, staring at the dead man's face, and wondered what kind of grandmother sent a warrior to die alone in the desert, waiting for 3 strangers who might never come. He wondered what kind of treaty could matter so much that its breaking required a message delivered at such cost. Most of all, he wondered what waited for them in calico, in a house of many colors, with a woman who seemed to know things she shouldn't know. Dawn came cold and bright, turning the desert from black to gold in the span of minutes. They buried the warrior in a shallow grave, covering him with stones to keep the scavengers away. They had no words to say over him, no prayers in his language or their own that seemed adequate. So they simply stood for a moment in silence, 3 outlaws paying respect to a man whose name they'd never learned, before turning south once more toward Calico and whatever truth waited there. But as they rode, Calhoun noticed something that made him pull his horse to a stop. On the ridge where they'd seen the riders the night before, there were tracks, fresh tracks, many horses, all heading south. And in the dust beside those tracks, drawn with careful precision, was a symbol that matched exactly the one carved into the white stone in Calhoun's pocket. Someone knew they were coming, someone knew what they carried. And as they urged their horses forward, the morning sun climbing behind them and the unknown town of Calico waiting somewhere ahead, each of them understood that the choice they'd made in that desert pass had set something in motion that could not now be stopped. The disappearance of 3 men and $17,000 might have been just another frontier crime, unremarkable in its execution and likely in its outcome. except for what happened 3 days after the Barstow robbery, when a prospector named William Esch rode into the town of Calico with a story that made no sense to anyone who heard it. Esch was known as a reliable man, not given to drink or fabrication, which made his account all the more troubling. He claimed to have seen 3 riders moving south through Rattlesnake Throat, dragging what looked like a wounded man on a travois. He'd kept his distance, as any sensible prospector would when encountering armed strangers in remote country, but he'd watched them make camp in a dry wash and seen them bury something, or someone, the following morning before continuing south. The sheriff of Barstow, a practical man named Thomas Wardell, rode out with a deputy to investigate Esch's claim. They found the grave easily enough, marked with stones that were too deliberately placed to be natural. What they found beneath those stones was a man of indeterminate tribal affiliation, dead from a gunshot wound to the torso, buried with what appeared to be respect rather than haste. His horse lay 30 yards away, shot cleanly through the heart. His saddle and bridle were gone. So was any identification. Wardell stood over that grave for a long time, trying to make the pieces fit together. 3 men rob a payroll wagon, killing no one, taking only money. 3 days later, 3 men are seen carrying a wounded man through country no one travels unless they're running from something. The wounded man dies and is buried with care. The 3 continue south toward Calico. It made no sense. Outlaws running from a robbery didn't stop to help dying strangers. They didn't waste time on burials. They didn't deviate from escape routes to deliver wounded men to towns where questions would be asked. The most logical explanation was that Esch had seen different men entirely, that the grave and the robbery were unconnected coincidences. But Wardell had learned to distrust coincidence, and something about the careful placement of those stones suggested men who'd made a choice they didn't fully understand themselves. He sent a telegram to Calico, warning the local deputy about possible criminals heading their way. The response came back within hours. 3 strangers had indeed arrived, checked into a boarding house, and then vanished. The landlady said they'd paid for a week but left after 2 days. They'd asked about a house of many colors. They'd seemed nervous, watchful, like men expecting trouble. Then they were gone. The landlady mentioned one other detail that Wardell noted carefully in his report. One of the men, the lean one with the weathered face, had asked specifically about a woman. Not by name, but by description. Someone who kept the house of many colors, someone who might know about treaties and messages. The landlady had looked at him strangely and said there was no such person in Calico, no house that matched that description. The man had thanked her and left, and she'd seen him arguing quietly with his companions on the street corner before all 3 mounted their horses and rode out of town heading west. That was April 17, 1877. It was the last confirmed sighting of the 3 men who'd robbed the Barstow payroll wagon. Everything after was rumor, speculation, and the slow accretion of legend that grows around unsolved mysteries like coral around sunken ships. The investigation that followed was hampered by everything that made law enforcement difficult in the territories. Communication between towns was slow and unreliable. Record-keeping was haphazard. Descriptions of the suspects varied wildly. One witness said they were all young. Another insisted the leader was over 50. Some remembered distinctive scars or clothing. Others recalled nothing useful at all. The vastness of the frontier meant a man could ride for days without encountering another soul, could change direction at will, could become someone else simply by moving to a new territory where his face wasn't known. Wardell pursued what leads existed with the thoroughness of a man who took his job seriously, even when that job seemed impossible. He interviewed everyone who'd been near Barstow the day of the robbery. He sent telegrams to sheriffs in 6 territories, describing the suspects as best he could. He tracked down rumors of 3 men matching the description who'd been seen in various towns, only to find the rumors were weeks old, or referred to different men entirely, or evaporated upon close examination into nothing but frontier gossip and wishful thinking. The payroll company offered a reward, $200 for information leading to the arrest of the robbers, $500 for the return of the stolen money. The posters went up in towns throughout California and Nevada, bearing descriptions so vague they could have applied to half the drifters in the West. Tall man, lean build, approximately 40 years old, younger man with facial scarring, heavyset man, possibly in his 50s, armed and dangerous. Possibly traveling together, possibly separated, possibly dead in some unnamed canyon where their bodies would never be found. Months passed. Spring turned to summer, and the desert became an even more inhospitable place where water sources dried to cracked mud, and the sun beat down with physical force. The reward money went unclaimed. The posters faded and curled in the heat. And slowly, inevitably, other crimes and other concerns pushed the Barstow robbery into the category of cold cases that lawmen kept in desk drawers and sometimes remembered on slow afternoons. But in Calico, something else was happening. The town had been built on silver, one of dozens of mining settlements that sprouted in the desert like fever dreams, sustained by hope and ore, and the constant influx of men seeking fortune. It was a transient place where few stayed long and fewer asked questions about where their neighbors came from. The boarding houses turned over tenants weekly. The saloons served strangers who arrived with full pockets and left with empty ones. It was exactly the kind of place 3 outlaws might choose to disappear, except they hadn't disappeared there. They'd arrived, asked their strange question about a house of many colors, and left. But the question itself had consequences no one anticipated. The landlady who'd spoken with them mentioned the encounter to her sister. The sister mentioned it to her husband, who worked claims alongside a dozen other miners. Within a week, half the town had heard about 3 strangers looking for something that didn't exist, asking about things no one understood, treaty they'd mentioned, a message. A woman who kept a house of many colors. Calico had no such woman, no such house. But memory is a strange thing, and in a town where people came and went like smoke, it was possible to forget things that had once seemed unremarkable. An old Mexican woman who'd lived on the edge of town had kept a small house painted in fading colors, yellow and blue and red, all sun-bleached and peeling. She'd been a healer of sorts, someone people visited for remedies and occasionally for advice. But she died 2 winters back and her house had been torn down for salvage lumber. Had those 3 men been looking for her? But if so, why? And what treaty could a poor curandera have known about? The speculation became a parlor game, a puzzle to occupy minds during the long hot months when the mines produced less and the future looked uncertain. Some people claimed the old woman had been more than she seemed, that she'd had connections to tribes from the interior, that people came to her with questions about things beyond herbs and poultices. Others dismissed this as superstition. A few mentioned that she'd had a grandson who visited occasionally, a man who moved between worlds, comfortable in neither. But no one knew what had become of him. In August, a prospector found something in the hills east of Rattlesnake Throat. It was a saddlebag, hidden in a crevice and covered with rocks, as if someone had intended to retrieve it but never returned. Inside were $1,700 in company scrip, bound with wire and marked with the Barstow payroll office stamp. Also in the bag were 3 letters, addressed to different names in different towns, never mailed. The letters were personal, not criminal. One was to a mother, one to a brother, one to a woman who might have been a wife or a sister. They spoke of regret, of intention to make amends, of hope that understanding might eventually come. They were signed with initials only, C, R, and G. Wardell rode out to examine the find himself. He stood in that crevice, holding those letters, trying to understand what kind of outlaws cached a small portion of their take, but kept the rest, trying to understand what kind of men wrote letters about regret and redemption while running from the law. The location bothered him most. The saddlebag had been hidden along a route that led neither to Calico nor to any other town, but rather into empty country where water was scarce and settlements were separated by days of hard riding. It suggested a change of plan. A decision made hastily, perhaps under duress. 3 men riding toward Calico, then veering away, splitting up or traveling together into wilderness, taking most of the money but leaving a portion, almost like an offering or a message. Writing letters they didn't mail, as if they'd meant to but circumstances prevented it. The letters were printed in newspapers, hoping someone might recognize the handwriting or the names mentioned. A woman in Sacramento claimed one letter was to her, from a son she hadn't seen in 5 years. But when pressed for details, her story fell apart. Dates didn't match. The handwriting was wrong. She was reaching for connection with a son who disappeared into the frontier and left no trace. Wardell pitied her, but he didn't believe her, and eventually she stopped insisting. The partial recovery of the money complicated everything. The payroll company reduced the reward, since their loss was now smaller. Some people took this as evidence the thieves had developed a conscience. Others saw it as a practical decision, desperate men lightening their load, knowing that every dollar in their saddlebags was evidence that could hang them. The newspapers ran editorials speculating about the motivations of men who stole, but then seemingly gave some of it back. Religious leaders used the case as a sermon illustration, talking about conscience and redemption, about the possibility of moral awakening even in hardened criminals. But none of this brought the authorities closer to finding the men themselves. Years passed. New sheriffs took over from old ones. Wardell retired, turning his files over to a younger man who looked at the old case reports with the detached interest of someone reading history rather than working an active investigation. The wanted posters came down, replaced by more recent crimes and more urgent concerns. The Barstow robbery became the kind of story old-timers told in saloons, embellished with each retelling, until it was hard to know what had actually happened and what had been added by imagination and time. Some said the 3 outlaws had been killed by rival criminals, their bodies left in some unnamed canyon. Others claimed they'd made it to Mexico and were living under new names, the stolen money funding quiet lives south of the border. A few insisted the men had joined one of the tribes gone native, disappeared into a world where white law couldn't follow. Each theory had its adherents, and none could be proved or disproved. Calico itself began to decline. The silver played out, as everyone knew it eventually would. The mines closed one by one. The population dwindled. By 1880, half the buildings stood empty. By 1885, the place was more ghost town than living settlement, sustained only by a handful of stubborn souls who refused to abandon what they'd built. The boarding house where the 3 men had stayed became a storage facility, then collapsed in a windstorm. The saloons closed. The main street grew quiet. But every few years, something would surface that would briefly revive interest in the old case. A prospector would find a belt buckle with initials that might have matched one of the suspects. A dying man in a hospital in San Francisco would make a confession that seemed relevant until the details were checked and found to be wrong. A woman in a Nevada mining camp would claim her husband had once told her a story about helping 3 fugitives, but she couldn't remember the details, and her husband was long dead. The most compelling lead came in 1891, 14 years after the robbery. A surveying crew working in the mountains east of where Calico had stood found a collapsed mine shaft that appeared to have been deliberately concealed. Inside were the remains of a camp, tin plates, a coffee pot, remnants of bedding. and carved into the stone wall, barely visible beneath years of mineral seepage, were 3 sets of initials and a date. CRG April 1877. The authorities investigated, but the site yielded nothing conclusive. No bodies, no money, no explanation for why 3 men would hide in a mine shaft or what had become of them afterward. The initials matched the letters found in the saddlebag, which suggested some connection, but that connection led nowhere. The mine shaft was in country so remote that reaching it required 2 days of difficult travel. Why would fugitives go there? What were they seeking or fleeing that would drive them into such isolation? One deputy suggested they'd been meeting someone, that the mine shaft was a rendezvous point for a planned handoff or negotiation. But with whom? And regarding what? The theory raised more questions than it answered, and eventually the investigation stalled once more for lack of evidence or direction. The new century arrived, bringing with it technologies that would have made the original investigation far simpler. Telegraphs became more widespread, photography became common, record-keeping improved. But these advances came too late for the Barstow robbery, which had occurred in the dying days of the old frontier, when a man could still vanish into empty space and be swallowed by distance and time. The case remained officially open, filed in a dusty archive in the county seat, marked with a notation that indicated little hope of resolution. The reward was rescinded in 1903, the company having long since dissolved and reformed under different ownership. The original case files were transferred to historical societies, no longer evidence in an active investigation, but documents of interest to people studying frontier crime and law enforcement. Students and researchers occasionally examined them, looking for thesis material or colorful anecdotes. None found anything that earlier investigators had missed, but memory persisted in unexpected ways. In 1928, an elderly woman in Barstow told her granddaughter a story she'd heard from her own grandmother, about 3 men who'd stopped at a trading post in 1877, asking about tribes to the east and whether any maintained peace treaties with settlers. The old woman couldn't remember more details, and by the time the granddaughter thought to report it to anyone, the old woman had passed away. The story went into the files as a curiosity, another fragment that explained nothing. In 1941, a construction crew breaking ground for a new highway found a wooden box buried 4 feet down, miles from any settlement. Inside were personal effects, a pocket watch, a leather journal with pages too water-damaged to read, a small white stone with a hole drilled through it and symbols carved into its surface. The watch was engraved with initials, J.C. The journal, when carefully dried and examined, yielded only a few legible words. Calico, grandmother, treaty, too late. The stone was sent to a university for analysis, where an anthropologist identified it as possibly Paiute or Shoshone in origin, a message token of some kind, but couldn't determine its specific meaning. The items were catalogued and stored. A local newspaper ran a brief story wondering if they might be connected to some old frontier mystery, but no one made the connection to the Barstow robbery, separated now by more than 60 years, remembered only by historians and the very old. The world moved on. The West became something other than wild, the empty spaces filled with towns and roads. The stories of outlaws and sheriffs and frontier justice became entertainment, simplified and romanticized beyond recognition. The real complexities, the moral ambiguities, the impossible choices, the men who straddled the line between criminal and human, were forgotten in favor of clearer narratives with heroes and villains easily distinguished. But then, in 1979, something happened that changed everything. A graduate student named Sarah Chen was working on her dissertation about frontier communication networks. She was examining old telegraph logs from various California towns, looking for patterns in how information spread across distances in the pre-telephone era. In a basement archive in Sacramento, she found a box of documents from a defunct telegraph office in Calico, records that had somehow survived the town's collapse and eventual abandonment. Most of the telegrams were routine, supply orders, personal messages, mining company business. But one caught her attention because of its date and content. It was from April 1877, sent from Calico to an office in Carson City, Nevada. The message was cryptic. 3 shadows arrived seeking color house stop woman gone 2 winters stop men, departed west with urgency stop believe connected to treaty matter stop await instructions stop. The message was signed with initials that meant nothing to Chen. M.K. But what struck her was the phrasing, 3 shadows, color house, treaty matter. The language suggested someone communicating in code, or someone trying to convey complex information within telegram brevity. She made a note of it and continued her research. It was only later, when she was cross-referencing dates and locations, that she noticed something else. The Barstow payroll robbery had occurred on April 11, 1877. 3 men had been seen in Calico on April 17. The telegram from Calico had been sent on April 19, and the reply from Carson City, which she found in a separate file, had come back the same day. Continue observation stop, protect the peace stop, report any further movement stop. Chen stared at those telegrams for a long time, feeling the electric thrill that comes when a researcher stumbles onto something significant. Someone in Calico had been watching for those 3 men. Someone in Carson City had been coordinating that observation. Treaty matter, the message had said. Protect the peace. She began to dig deeper, pulling files about treaties and frontier agreements from the 1870s. She found references to peace negotiations between various tribes and settler communities, most of them fragile arrangements that had ultimately failed. She found mention of agents and intermediaries, men and women who moved between worlds trying to prevent the violence that seemed inevitable as the frontier closed. And she found, buried in a report from a Department of Interior investigator, a reference to a woman known as the grandmother, who had served as an unofficial mediator in several disputes and was known to have connections throughout the region. The woman had died in 1875, the report noted, but her network had continued operating, watching for threats to the fragile peace that she had helped establish. The report mentioned concerns that her death might lead to a collapse of several treaty arrangements and recommended continued government support for her successors. Chen's heart was racing now. She pulled the old case file on the Barstow robbery, which she'd seen referenced in several historical documents. She read about the 3 men who'd vanished, about the wounded man they'd carried through the desert, about their strange questions in Calico regarding a woman and a house of many colors, about the money they'd hidden, the letters they'd written, the mine shaft where they'd carved their initials. And suddenly, impossibly, a different story began to emerge from the fragments. 3 men rob a payroll wagon, then encounter a dying man who claims to be waiting for them. They carry him toward a town, seeking a woman who can explain what's happening, only to find she died years before. They hide part of the money, as if acknowledging they've become part of something larger than their original crime. They disappear into empty country, toward a mine shaft in the mountains, leaving behind only initials and unanswered questions. Not outlaws fleeing justice, Chen thought, or not only that. Men who'd stumbled into something they didn't understand, something involving treaties and messages, and a network of people trying to prevent bloodshed on the frontier. Men who'd made a choice in a desert past that had connected them to a story much larger than themselves. She couldn't prove any of it. The evidence was fragmentary, separated by years and miles, preserved more by accident than design. But sitting in that archive, Surrounded by documents and telegraph logs and the accumulated debris of a vanished world, Sarah Chen understood that she'd found something remarkable, not the solution to an old mystery, but the outline of a different question entirely. What had those three men been trying to do? What treaty had they been protecting? And where, in the vast wilderness of the frontier, had their journey finally ended? She opened her laptop and began to type, knowing that what she was beginning would take years to complete, would require following leads that might go nowhere, would mean traveling to remote locations and interviewing descendants of people who'd long ago turned to dust. But she also knew, with the certainty that sometimes comes to researchers in moments of discovery, that the story of the three shadows who'd chosen mercy over murder was not finished. It was simply waiting for someone to read it correctly, to understand what the fragments meant when assembled in a different order. Outside the archive, the California sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that the Old West would have recognized. Inside, surrounded by paper and dust and the patient silence of history, Chen began the work of bringing three forgotten men back into the light. The story was not over. It was only now, 102 years later, beginning to be properly told. Sarah Chen's research consumed the next 3 years of her life, pulling her deeper into the past than any dissertation required. She followed paper trails through a dozen archives, traced telegraph logs across 4 states, and interviewed elderly people whose grandparents had once mentioned names or places that might connect. Most leads evaporated upon examination. But slowly, carefully, she began to assemble a picture of what had existed in the spring of 1877, a network of communication and cooperation that history had largely forgotten. The grandmother, as she was known in a dozen different communities, had been a woman named Maria Kelso. She was half Mexican, half Paiute, and she'd spent 30 years of her life mediating between tribes and settlers, preventing small disputes from becoming massacres. She'd operated without official sanction, funded by private donations from people who understood that peace was cheaper than war. She'd maintained contacts throughout the territories, people who watched and listened and sent messages through channels that left no formal records. She died in the winter of 1875, and her network had struggled to continue without her. Her house in Calico, the one painted in many colors as a signal to those who knew what to look for, had been torn down after her death. But her grandson had tried to carry on her work, riding between communities, carrying messages, watching for the tensions that might explode into violence. Chen found a photograph of him in a collection at the Nevada Historical Society. He stood straight and proud in buckskin and denim both, his face serious, his eyes looking directly at the camera with an intensity that bridged the decades. The photograph was labeled only with initials and a year, J.K. 1876, but the woman who donated the collection had included a note. Jonathan Kelso, called Stands Alone by his mother's people, died April 1877, circumstances unknown, April 1877. The month of the Barstow robbery, the wounded man in the desert, the 3 outlaws who'd carried him toward Calico. Chen requested every document related to Stands Alone that she could find. The results were sparse. A few letters, some official correspondence with the Department of Interior, a mention in a missionary's journal, but enough emerged to sketch a life lived between worlds, trusted by neither and essential to both. He'd been educated in church schools but refused to abandon his mother's traditions. He'd worn white man's clothing but kept his hair long. He'd spoken 4 languages and belonged fully to none of the cultures that used them. In the spring of 1877, according to a letter Chen found in a private collection, Stands Alone had learned something that alarmed him deeply. A land agent named Harrison Weir had been selling parcels that belonged to Paiute families under treaty protection. The sales were fraudulent, the deeds forged, but white settlers were already moving onto the disputed land. Stans alone had tried to raise the alarm through official channels, but his warnings had been ignored or delayed by bureaucratic indifference. The letter, written to a sympathetic Indian agent in Carson City, was dated April 1, 1877. Stans alone wrote that if the matter wasn't addressed immediately, violence would come. Young men on both sides were talking about taking justice into their own hands. The piece his grandmother had built was hours away from collapse. He was riding to intercept someone who might help, someone his grandmother had foreseen. The letter ended abruptly. I go to the place she named. If the three come, they will know what to do. If they do not, then perhaps it was not meant to be, and we will face what comes with what strength we have. Chen sat with that letter for a long time, reading it over and over, the place she named, the three. And 11 days later, 3 men robbed a payroll wagon and then rode into Rattlesnake Throat, where they found a dying man who'd been waiting for them. She pulled the old case files again, looking at them through this new lens. The payroll they'd robbed hadn't been from a mining company or a railroad. It had been payment for land agents, including Harrison Weir, money meant to fund the administrative costs of opening new territories to settlement. The 3 men hadn't just stolen money. They disrupted, however briefly, the machinery of fraudulent land transfer. Had they known? Had they chosen that target deliberately? Or had they simply been outlaws looking for an easy score, who'd stumbled into a larger story by accident? Chen found part of the answer in a memoir published in 1938, written by a woman named Elizabeth Calhoun Reed. The memoir was mostly about frontier life and raising children in mining camps, but it included a brief passage about her father, whom she'd never met. He'd been an outlaw, she wrote without shame, a man who'd made poor choices in his youth. But her mother had told her that he'd also been a man who'd tried, late in his life, to make amends. The passage included a detail that made Chen's breath catch. My mother said he'd once carried a white stone with symbols carved into it. He'd told her it was a reminder of a choice he'd made, a moment when he'd chosen to be part of something larger than himself. He'd carried it until the day he died, though he never explained what it meant. Elizabeth Calhoun Reed, daughter of one of the 3 men who'd vanished in 1877. Chen searched for more information about the mother and found her in census records. Margaret Reed, married to Thomas Reed in 1882, a widow by 1890. No record of where Thomas Reed had come from, no documentation of his life before his marriage. Just a man who'd appeared in a small Nevada town, worked as a ranch hand, married a local woman, and died of pneumonia at age 43. Chen found his grave in a cemetery outside of Tonopah. The headstone was simple. Thomas Reed, 1847-1890, beloved husband and father. But someone had left a white stone on top of the marker, and though it was surely a recent addition, placed by some descendant or history enthusiast, Chen felt a chill looking at it. One of the 3 had survived. Had lived quietly under a different name, had married and raised a daughter, had carried the memory of April 1877 for the rest of his life. But what about the others? What had become of C and G, the 2 men whose initials appeared in the hidden letters and carved into the mine shaft wall? The mine shaft itself yielded the next clue. Chen hired a guide and made the difficult journey to the site, which was now on land managed by the Bureau of Land Management. The entrance had been sealed for safety, but she obtained permission to examine it with a professional cave surveyor. Inside, past the collapsed section that earlier investigators had documented, they found a second chamber that had been missed. The chamber contained the remains of 2 men, seated side by side against the wall, their skeletons still clothed in deteriorated leather and denim. Between them was a leather satchel, and inside that satchel was $15,000 in company scrip, carefully bundled and preserved by the dry air. Also in the satchel was a letter, written in a clear hand on paper that had yellowed but remained legible. The letter was addressed to no one in particular, a message to whoever might find it. Chen read it by the light of her headlamp, the words swimming slightly as her eyes filled with tears. We went looking for a woman who could tell us what to do, and found she had been dead 2 years. We rode to Carson City and spoke to the agent there, who listened but could not promise action fast enough. We rode to the disputed lands and warned the settlers that their deeds were fraudulent, that they were being used by a man who would profit from their conflict with the people he had stolen from. Some listened, most did not. We tried to find Harrison Weir to recover the forged documents to stop what was coming. We found his office burned and him gone, fled with money not his own. We were blamed for the fire, though we set no torch. We were named as instigators, though we sought only to prevent. The law that we had broken with our theft now pursued us for crimes we did not commit. Thomas chose to leave us, to take a portion of the money and seek a life elsewhere. We did not blame him. He had a woman waiting, a future possible if he could reach it before his name became too known. Gaines and I came here, to this place where no one would think to look, because we understood that we had become inconvenient to too many people. The settlers did not want to hear that their land was stolen. The agent did not want to admit his oversight. And Weir would pay well to silence anyone who knew what he had done. We carried a dying man because he had waited for us. We sought a woman who could explain what we had stumbled into. We tried to honor a message we barely understood. I do not know if it mattered. I do not know if the violence was prevented or only delayed. But I know that for a brief moment, 3 men who had lived for themselves alone tried to be part of something larger. The money remains with us, because to spend it would draw attention we cannot afford, and because it has become something other than money. It is evidence of theft, yes, but also of the theft that provoked our theft, the crime that made us criminals in service of something we believed was just. If you find this, know that we were not good men, but we tried at the end to be better than we had been. That will have to be enough. The letter was signed. John Calhoun and Samuel Gaines, May 1877. Chen stood in that chamber for a long time, looking at the 2 skeletons seated in eternal vigil over the money they'd stolen, and then refused to spend. The surveyor waited respectfully near the entrance, understanding without being told that this was a moment that required silence. Later, after the authorities had been notified and the remains removed for proper burial, after the money had been returned to the descendants of the payroll company, and the letter placed in an archive, Chen tried to piece together what had actually happened in those weeks of April and May, 1877. 3 men rob a payroll wagon, taking money that would fund fraudulent land transfers. They encounter a dying man who seems to have been waiting for them, who tells them about a broken treaty and a woman who can explain. They carry him toward the only place that makes sense, only to find the woman dead and her network barely functioning. They try to navigate a situation they don't fully understand, making decisions that turn them from simple thieves into players in a larger game of land and law, and the eternal conflict between peoples who want the same earth. They become wanted not just for their original crime but for the disruption they cause, the questions they ask, the pattern they threaten to expose. One escapes and builds a new life. 2 hide in a mine shaft, either waiting for safety that never comes or accepting that they've reached the end of whatever road they were traveling. The violence that stands alone feared did eventually come, though perhaps later and lesser than it might have been. There were skirmishes over the disputed land in 1878. Harrison Weir was never prosecuted, but he disappeared from public records after 1879, his fate unknown. The treaty protections were eventually, partially honored, though many Paiute families lost land they'd been promised. History recorded it as another sad chapter in the closing of the frontier, one among dozens, notable for nothing in particular. The 3 men who'd briefly intersected with these events were footnotes at best, criminals whose strange behavior had never been adequately explained, until Sarah Chen stood before a conference of Western historians in 2082 and told a different story. She presented the evidence carefully, walking her audience through the documents and letters and telegraph logs. She showed them the photograph of Stands Alone, the grave of Thomas Reed, the letter from the mine shaft. She talked about Maria Kelso and the network of peacemakers who'd operated in the shadows of official history. She explained how 3 outlaws had been pulled into a story larger than themselves, how they tried to honor a message they barely understood, how they paid for that choice with everything they had. The audience listened in silence. When she finished, an elderly man in the back row raised his hand. He introduced himself as Martin Reed, great-great-grandson of Thomas Reed. He said he'd grown up hearing family stories about an ancestor who'd been an outlaw but also something more. His grandmother had shown him a white stone she'd inherited, covered with symbols no one could read. He'd always wondered what it meant. After the presentation, people came forward with their own fragments. A woman whose great-grandmother had been Paiute said her family told stories about 3 white men who'd warned settlers about bad land deals, who tried to prevent a war even though they had no reason to care. A historian from Nevada mentioned documents he'd seen about the Harrison Weir case, fraudulent deeds that had been exposed by someone, though the records never said who. Chen listened to all of it, gathering fragments, understanding that the story she'd uncovered was itself fragmentary, that the full truth had died with the men who'd lived it, but what remained was enough. Enough to understand that 3 men who'd started as simple thieves had become something else in the desert heat of April 1877. Enough to know that a dying man's message had found its intended recipients, even though the woman who'd sent him was 2 years dead. Enough to see that mercy, once chosen, had consequences that rippled far beyond the moment of choosing. The Historical Society arranged for a proper memorial for Calhoun and Gaines, buried now in a cemetery with markers bearing their names and dates, and a simple inscription. They carried a stranger when they could have ridden on. Thomas Reed's grave received a new marker as well, one that named him as John Calhoun, outlaw and father, who'd lived long enough to make a different choice matter. Stands Alone, whose body had never been found despite the grave near Rattlesnake Throat, was honored in a ceremony attended by descendants of the people he'd tried to protect. Chen was invited to speak, and she talked about the invisible threads that connect us across time, about the choices that define us more than our circumstances, about the strange mercy of history that sometimes allows forgotten stories to surface when they're needed most. But it was Martin Reed who said the thing that stayed with everyone present. He stood before the memorial to the man who'd been his great-great-grandfather, holding the white stone that had been carried for so long, and he said simply, he was a thief who tried to become something else. The sun was setting over the Nevada desert, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. The memorial stood in a quiet corner of the cemetery, near enough to the mountains that you could see the rough country where the mine shaft lay sealed. Somewhere in that vastness was the pass called Rattlesnake Throat, and the spot where 3 men had found a dying warrior, and the choice they'd made that would haunt 2 territories in 150 years. Chen stood watching the sunset, thinking about all the stories the desert kept, all the truths that time buried and sometimes, rarely, allowed to surface. She thought about Maria Kelso painting her house in many colors, creating a signal that would outlast her. About Stands Alone riding to wait for men he'd never met, trusting his grandmother's vision. About 3 outlaws who could have ridden on but didn't, who tried to honor something they barely understood. The desert stretched away in all directions, vast and indifferent, keeping its remaining secrets. The wind moved across it, erasing tracks, smoothing sand, doing the patient work of forgetting. But some things Chen understood now refused to be forgotten. Some choices echoed across decades, waiting for someone to hear them correctly. Some mercies, once given, became permanent things, seeds that lay dormant until conditions allowed them to flower into understanding. She touched the memorial stone once, gently, the way you touch something that carries the weight of lives lived and choices made. Then she walked back to her car as darkness gathered over the frontier that was no longer frontier, over the wild that had been tamed, over the past that had finally, partially, yielded its truth. Behind her, the memorial stood silent in the gathering night, 3 names carved in stone. We were not good men, but we tried to be better. That will have to be enough. The stars came out, the same stars that had watched 3 riders carry a dying man through the desert heat. The wind continued its eternal work. And somewhere in the darkness, the frontier kept the rest of its stories, waiting for the day when someone would care enough to listen, to piece together fragments, to understand that history is not what happened but what we choose to remember and how we choose to remember it. The mystery of the Barstow robbery had been solved, as much as any mystery can be solved across the gulf of time. 3 men had stolen money, then stolen something else, a chance to be part of something that mattered, a moment of mercy in the vast indifference of the desert, a choice that would define them more truly than any crime. They had been outlaws. They had been criminals. But in the end, when the accounting was done and the fragments assembled and the truth partially revealed, they had also been men who tried to answer a dying stranger's faith in them, who'd carried shadow but sought light, who'd stood for one brief moment between fire and innocence. That would have to be enough. In the vast accounting of the frontier, in the endless ledger of choices made and roads taken, it was enough. The desert accepted their story, as it accepted all stories eventually, folding them into the endless landscape where nothing is truly lost, but only waiting to be found by those patient enough to search. And the sun set, and the stars wheeled overhead, and the past settled into its final form, not forgotten but remembered, not solved but understood, not ended but complete.